to Corporate Cafecito, a podcast based on professional development, career growth, and respecting our cultural identity. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Corporate Cafecito. Yo soy Nayeli Suarez Guest. And back with me today is Maria Burns Ortiz. And for those of you who haven't listened to her episode on 7th-generation games, you absolutely must. So welcome back, Maria.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be there the first time, and I'm even more excited to be back.
Yeah. So if you heard the episode that we had with Maria last time, we were really talking about the development of her game, the cultural identity, representation, and the way our children interact with these educational games that have like different, cultures, not just the Mexican culture, but it brings into like all the dynamic cultures that we see here in the US. She has received a ton of accolades. She has been the Rising Emerging Star by the National Latina Business Women's Association. She's been invited to the White House for her work as an entrepreneur. If we look at all this, you would say Maria is just like a huge success, right? You've been recognized by homeschools.com, Best Learning Games Artwork by the Department of Education. You just have done exceptional work, just really getting our culture forward and making sure that no kid is really left behind or feels out of place.
Yeah, we try.
Yeah. Having said that, one of the topics we talked about in our first cafecito was getting a no.
Right. Yeah.
And how, what that feels like, how do you overcome it? So why don't we start there? Talk to us about your no's or your first no or the no you remember the most.
Yeah. Oh, well, I have a list. I actually keep it in my mind. And then, especially one of those things, one of my lists is like investors, right? Because we were raising money and there's a lot of people that said no to me in the beginning. And my mom jokes, I don't know if it's fully a joke that I'm like driven by spite, but I'm like, you will rue the day, right?
Yeah. You're going to lose out, mister. You're like Pretty Woman, right? You work on commission, right?
Exactly. And I will say, I keep track of like who's invested in what and where those companies went. And, there's a lot of those people that said no and passed on us and put a lot of money in a lot of other places that no longer exist. Right. And I don't know if I take satisfaction in that, but it just goes to prove to me that those people were wrong. Right. My sister always says, she's like, people, she talks about, she was talking about self-esteem in high school, though, she's saying, people would say, oh, when you're young, and I think this applies whether you're talking about being a young woman or a company. And in the beginning, you're like, people don't like me. They think I'm ugly, they whatever. And she's, then I got older and I realized, those people are idiots. I'm fabulous. and I try to take that approach with myself, like someone passes on something or we really feel like we should have gotten something and we didn't, whether it's a deal or a contract or a grant or whatever that is, my thing is more like they've made a huge mistake, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't bother me. Like there's sometimes where I will be like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. And a couple of weeks later, I'm still angry about it. It'll come up and I'll be like, but I think that's a big part of it is understanding. And I hate when people say, they're not saying no. It's not a reflection on you. And the truth is, no, in some ways it is. Because if you thought what I was doing was phenomenal and amazing, then you would have given me the money or the contract or the whatever. Right. But that doesn't mean that they're right? Just because they didn't have that reflection on me that I'm as amazing as I think that I am, it doesn't mean that I'm not, And so I think that's been a big thing for me is really understanding like our value and worth and what we bring to the table. And then, as I said last time, my mom is one of my co-founders. And one thing that she cites to me that I've said before, and she's like, I always like when you said, one thing is not make or break. And, she'll throw that back at me, whatever we're doing. Well, this one thing isn't going to be a make or break. And I think that having that understanding has been really, really helpful to me to say that you're right. It isn't going to be the one thing that shifts it. And in the beginning, you might think it is the one thing. You're like, this one thing.
Yeah, if I could just have this, please.
Exactly.
I've worked with a lot of startups and, everybody's like, I have this great idea. And so I'm just going to do my friends and family round. I've had to work with investors for my Drop Needles drink company, which is a sparkling wine cocktail and available in the Chicagoland area in Arizona. But but we have to work with a lot of investors. When I work with startups or different companies to like help set up their business plan and whatnot, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to ask all my friends and family to invest and then I'll be fine. I'll have like this much money. And I'm like, have you asked your friends for money yet? Because everyone thinks it's a great idea when you're not asking them to contribute.
Right.
Once you're like, I need $50,000 to make my dream happen, your dream doesn't have the same backing.
Right.
It goes drops a little bit and you say no. And, you can't internalize that, right? Like we're asking people to give up a big chunk of change. And so I usually start by saying, ask people you don't know, like ask business people, because they'll have a better gauge on like success factor and things like that. And, and sometimes I'm like, family will get too vested in what you're doing and what, reports. And I'm like,
See, yeah, it's interesting when we did our first round, and we did some venture capital more recently, and so that's a little bit different. But when we did our first round for the investors that we had, I would say in some ways this probably it's the example of what you should not say, but I needed to say it, which is I said, do not give me any more money than you can stand to lose, right? I don't want that. And when you're pitching, especially early on, you're supposed to be saying, I'm going to bring back this money, I'm going to do this return, I'm going to do all these things. And I really believed that we were going to be able to do that and build that. But I also didn't want it hanging over me, the stresses of I have to return all of these people who some of them who I knew well, some of them we didn't know.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to have that stress hanging over me at the detriment of being able to build the company. And I think that is a really challenging thing. And even now with investors, I feel a very large responsibility. And there's been points, where we're in good shape, especially at the moment. There's been points just during, the pandemic and lots of different ebbs and flows of business over the year where I've had investors say, look, if you have to shut down, and we've never been to the point where we really sat down and thought, but that it said, if you have to shut down, that's the worst thing that happens. In my head at the time, and even still now, I'm like, no, because then we're failing those people. But I did think it was really important to me early on that I didn't have to worry about, if this doesn't work out, I've lost so-and-so's retirement, right?
Yeah. Like they counted on me. They believed in me.
Right.
And now I have to deliver.
Right. But so I to me, it was really early. Don't give me more than you can stand to lose, because I don't, in some ways, maybe I'm not making the right decisions for the business if I'm operating from a place of fear as opposed to a place of being empowered, which is what your investors largely, hopefully, if you have good investors, want you to do, is to operate from what moves do I need to make, even if it's short and long-term gain. And, and I've also told all of the investors we have, like, this is especially, we're in ed tech. So it's not an 18-month turnaround. Like, sit down, we've got the next, we're probably together for a decade, and be able to build that out. But I think that really makes it easier for me in a lot of ways to make the decisions that I've made, and why we're still here. When, like I said, that list of companies that funds and they probably don't know who they are, but I do, are no longer around. And I think that's a really important thing. One of the things that's interesting, you're talking about no's, and one of the things that my mom has said before is, sometimes I want my blessings not in disguise, right? Like, you didn't get something and you'll be like, well, it was a blessing in disguise. We didn't get that investment or this contract, and but it is sometimes true, because I think there's some points where we were asking for money, especially the earlier years when we were starting out, or there were points where we were building out something and we've actually shifted over to being a different kind of product, that if I'd gotten, $2 million at that point, I probably would not have been able to effectively spend it the way that I could today. Right. And so I think that sometimes those no's, even though I feel like we could have done good things with that, I think they didn't necessarily hinder us. In some ways, they made us more scrappy and made us more kind of forward-looking and resilient, and kept us lean as an organization. And so they maybe did benefit us. Although, like I said, I still think everyone should always say yes.
Say yes, 100% all the time. Was there ever a no that just crushed your soul?
I feel like early on, I took them more personal. I don't think there was ever one that just destroyed me, but I think I took them much more personal. There were certainly a couple of, and like I said, both in investments and contracts, we've also done a bunch of grants. And so there were things where I just thought, "Mm, why is that way? Why
Yeah.
would you not just give it to us? We're doing good things. We're doing all the things like, and sometimes I think it was more just, what more do you want from
Yeah. Like
me?
you have everything.
Exactly.
Like this should be easy. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and in investment, the thing that really, I would say, gets to me is the bar always moves, right? So it'll be like, oh, you don't have, there's this a very specific example that I have in mind. You don't have 20,000 users. Okay, I came back. Well, you didn't have, now we've got 50,000 users. Well, you didn't get the 50,000 users fast enough. Well, you didn't, okay, well, do you have revenue? Yes, but now your revenue is not high enough. I have that. Well, that wasn't. And so sometimes I think that was more frustrating to me than soul crushing, but it was one of those things that made me realize that there are just people that you can never make
Right.
happy. And it was as you were talking about the example of people who, get investors and you have to deliver, and people being nice, or talking to your friends and them saying, yes, I like it, but then no one giving you money. And I think that's the case in some ways too, is people are often, even the VCs of the world who pretend that they're jerks, some of them are, but inherently kind, right? So if you're like,
No, yeah.
here's my thing, I really love it, I put so much time and energy into it, people are going to say, oh, yes, that's great. They're not going to say, well, this is terrible and this part of it is awful and no one wants that. And this, because they don't want to hurt you. And so they will just
Right.
come up with different ways and reasons why it's not a fit. When, to be honest, sometimes the best thing they could do for you is say,
Is give you that feedback.
exactly, that
Yes.
honest feedback. And I don't know if people are worried about, like I said, being sued in some cases or hurting people's feelings or whatever it is. But I think sometimes the best thing you can do is say, what's the real reason? And maybe the reason is, I don't invest in anything that it comes from someone I don't know. I mean, maybe that I don't know
Right.
what the reason
Yeah.
is, but
Whatever the reason is, like
that is
it may
easier
not
than
be about you at all,
exactly.
but we do
Yeah,
internalize it.
exactly. And so I've tried to start, like I said, realizing that it maybe isn't a reflection of me. Um, I always say to people, like, if you can figure out how to actually do that, let me know, because
Yeah.
I've yet to. But I do think that's a big part of it too, is, it is very personal to you because it's your thing, but to them, it might be personal and it has nothing to do with you.
Oh, 1,000%. Because we have all these external factors that may be weighing in on our decision making. To me, the no's that I have the hardest time with are the ones where I feel so confident
Mhm.
that it's just
Yes.
like, I was like up here and I was like, what? No. And,
Right.
and I'll be honest, I had one of those a week ago.
Mhm.
And I remember leaving this business and I was just like, oh my God, like this was such a no-brainer to me.
Right.
Like I came in prepared, I had everything ready, I had my numbers ready to go. The person brushed me off in like maybe 3 minutes. And I just remember leaving there and I was so defeated. Um, Not spiteful, but but I was just like, why can't he see this? Part of me goes back to like my mentality from childhood when we would go to the doctor and then we would go to McDonald's. So I was like, you know what? I'm having a bad moment. I'm going to go through the drive-through and make this day better. And then I'll tell myself like, I can't go home on a no, or I can't go home on a low. So I'll make like a couple calls or, talk to people that are going to lift me up. Because I don't want the business load to translate into my personal life. I don't want to come home and be sad around my kids.
Right.
Not that they can't see me sad, but like it's work, right? I
Right.
should be able to be like, that was work. He doesn't like this person wasn't saying no to me. They were saying
Right.
no to this proposal and this amount of money and et cetera. So I have to like go through that process while I eat a hamburger and just be able to walk into the house without bringing that emotion with me.
I think it was last time I was saying, having children has been really helpful to me because
Yep.
before then I wasn't an entrepreneur, but there'd be things that didn't go my way or I didn't get or something, whether it was a job or something I applied for, and I didn't get it. And it was just a big deal. And then I had kids and I think they kind of temper that in a lot of ways, whether it's because and I will say
Yeah.
they temper the highs too. It's like, oh my God, I get this giant deal. Like, oh, great. You don't know where my shoes are.
Yeah. Well, this is
I
the worst day ever for me.
I
Yeah.
told you to bring baby Mickey Stuffy when you picked me up. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, fine. But I do think, it's really helpful to kind of have that,
Yeah.
I think, kind of way to even you out because, yeah, at the end of the day, like they don't care whether I got a big deal or I didn't get a big deal or, somebody invested a ton of money, somebody
Right.
didn't, they just, goes
They
on as
just
usual.
have
And
to
it's kind of
eat.
a,
Yeah.
exactly.
Someone was saying like a meme and it said, make sure to drink water and go get some sun. You're just a big plant.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's just that I do think that it is important though that you don't
Mhm.
carry it with you. And
Agreed.
that's one of those things over the years I've gotten much better at doing, and every once in a while,
Mhm.
sometimes it'll come back like, gosh, I can't believe we didn't get that. But before I dwell on it for, a lot longer, a couple of days, I'd be like, oh, this is just, now I'm like, okay, well, so and
Yeah.
it's funny
It
too,
didn't
because
work. Yeah.
I was going through something and the other day there was, there were things that I'd done that I'd forgotten that were such a big deal at the time. We got this grant or we got this project or this thing.
Or
And I thought,
this award, you have
yeah,
100. Yeah.
exactly. And I just thought, oh my goodness, it was such a big deal. And it was actually, I previous to this, I was at ESPN and writing for them. And it was really
Mhm.
funny because I was coming up with a list of them and I'd forgotten that I'd written about soccer. And that was the first role that I got over there to do was be a soccer writer. And like, I thought I'd made it. It was the greatest moment of my life. And then 16 years later, it totally slipped my mind that I had even done it. And I think it was a good reminder to me. I just started laughing and I was with my sister at the time. She's like, what's so funny? I was like, it's just, and it doesn't mean it wasn't important, but it means obviously in the grand scheme of life, none of
Right.
those things are important. And it's kind of, at the end that, how does it
I
work out?
love that story. That's so true. Like the things that we think are so big at the moment that we think like there's no way it could get better than this.
Right,
And then you go do something better.
right,
And then
right.
you go do or something different. I think that that's really important a lot of times, to not get stuck in the moment
Yeah.
and not wallow in it because it's so easy. Like our brain feeds off negativity. So
Mhm.
if we just stay there and talk about like why this didn't go well or even blame shift and say, well, that person doesn't know like a
Yeah.
good deal when they see it or et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Like I think we could get really stuck there and go into being the victim
Yeah. Yeah.
instead of doing a transition of like, okay, you know what? I'm going to do these steps and then I'm going to feel better and then I'm going to move forward.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, very rarely has it happened where it's like, well, the next thing didn't work out the way it was, not maybe there's times certainly it's felt like a
Mhm.
bunch of losses in a row, but then there's times where you turn around, it feels like a bunch of wins in a row. And I just,
Yes.
sometimes it's a roller coaster, right? And you
Yeah.
just hope that, it's, good at the end, and I think that's kind of what I'm aiming for.
That
And
it
I
was
think
worth the 30-second ride.
exactly, exactly. And so, yeah, I really try and be more mindful of that because it's, sometimes things don't work out. I always quote my mom, but she has a lot of good now it's funny because now my sisters and I we just kind of switch them around. We don't know who says them, which is, people and she talks about this as not just as like a, she's like, look, people get what's coming to them at the end of the day, just not
Mhm.
necessarily the end of today. And I think that's really helpful is that's right, but sometimes you're like, it just seems like it's been an endless number of
Forever.
weeks
Yeah.
before, but
Mhm.
I do think that, when I look back at things, I'm like, okay, yeah, it did. And we do investor reports, for our,
Mhm.
our board and our investors. And one of the things that I do a lot is every quarter, you sit down and you look at it. And it's really helpful to do that look back and to see, we're talking about, seeing the forest through the trees, because I think sometimes you can get really focused on that day to day and not see the progress and the growth and this no actually made us shift something and that resulted in
Right.
these 10 yeses, right? And you don't really think about it afterward. You just keep moving forward. But sometimes then you turn around and you're like, wow, actually, it's worked out really well. And
Right.
I don't like to say this, so the people like, see, it was good that we didn't give you this or whatever it is. No, I could have done even more. But no, I think it's really important to like look at that and say, not just what happened at that moment, but then reflect later on and be like, oh, actually, it did all work out.
I'm a big believer that things work out how they're
Yeah.
supposed to. Um, but the no burns.
Yeah.
And so just being able to go through that burn and, I like what you said, like it's the trees in the forest, right? We've got to be able to go past like what's right in front of us.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing with the nose is the transition time. Like just to give myself that moment to even just say like, wow, that sucked.
Right.
And then, acknowledge like that it's over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times when we're sitting there and saying like, oh man, this sucks, or this didn't go how I wanted it, or I didn't get the sale, we can start critiquing too much. And like you said earlier, it may not have even been about us.
I think that's so true. And I think it's important. I hope, at least for me, it's helpful when someone else
Mhm.
says, yeah, that sucks too. Because the one thing that I hate is when people are like, well, like to take that moment, like, hey, let's all just take a moment and like be like, that sucks. And then we can move on. As
Yes.
opposed to sometimes
Yes.
I feel like people almost come in with like a level of positivity. Well, it was for the best, sometimes it's okay. And I think there's something to have that little validation, like, yeah, it does
Yeah,
suck.
it
Now
sucks.
what do we
Yeah.
do? Where do we go from here? As opposed to sometimes like over positivity, I think can make it people mean well, but I think it's like, can we all just acknowledge that it does suck? And
Yeah,
sometimes we
that we
don't
worked
want
really
to.
hard and it didn't work out. Yeah.
Exactly. And
No,
and
I
mourn
love
it for
that.
a minute. And then we go
Yeah.
on. But I think it is really helpful because otherwise too, I think if you don't get a chance to just be like, then that kind of can build up and be worse, right? As opposed
Yep.
to get it out. Okay, now where do we go next? And I think that's one thing we try and do. Okay, this didn't work. Let's be angry for a couple of minutes. And then
Right.
where do we go next is a big thing, as opposed to what did we learn from that? How can we shift things? And maybe we're not going to shift anything, and that's fine too, but just really using it as a checkpoint, as opposed to a defining moment.
I love that. Yes. We will use our nose as a checkpoint, not a defining moment. And we won't get stuck there.
Right.
And, to what you're saying, I think a lot of times it's in our nature to want to fix things, right?
Yes.
Like if a friend comes to us and they say, oh, this and this happened, we're like, did you try this? Did you try this?
Right.
Ponte this and whatever. And you're right. You know what? I think we need to get really in the practice of just sitting there and being like, it sucks. I remember my friend went through a really bad breakup and we were supposed to like take a trip and like that weekend. And so I told her, I was like, okay, you can cry today and tomorrow. But then when we go to the trip, like we're going to eat, we're going to drink, we're going to swim in the pool. Like we're going to do those things because while this sucks, we also booked this trip
Right.
and
Right.
both can be true. Sit there and cry today because it does suck. And she was just like, you know what? I like that you let me cry for, 2 days. And I'm like, yeah, like, and we're still not going to be over him for a little bit, but that's
Right.
okay because when we are, we'll know.
So my oldest daughter just turned 16. And I think that's a big thing that I've learned too, is like, having kids, and when they're little, you can solve their problems. And when you're
Mhm.
older, one, you probably can't. And
Yeah.
two, they don't want you to, right? And so a lot of it is
Mhm.
just, and is saying like, oh wow, that really sucks. And I think my husband's a little bit more of a fixer and he wants to like
Mhm.
do this, do that. I'm like, honestly, if she applied to a program and for something and she didn't get in, like there's nothing that can be done other than just say, okay, take a few days. And that doesn't mean that she doesn't have to do anything ever
Right.
again, but just to say, and I think when you have a teen, I get my son's still 9, but when you have a teenage girl house, you just realize like, you know what? I'm just gonna like back this out, let you have your moment, then we'll go on. And I think it's very similar in that regard, is like, okay,
Yeah.
we'll move forward, but just sometimes there's not a right thing to say, and I don't no way to fix it. And I think sometimes, like you say, yeah, people tend to be fixers and want to make things better. And I think sometimes just saying like, yeah, it is what
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Let's
No
figure
one
something
likes
out.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And just that feeling of like, because I think no's are very lonely, right? Because
Yes.
especially when you're running the
Oh, the
company,
yeses, you have high fives, you have like all these things to celebrate yeses, but the nos are lonely.
right? And yeah, and you feel like, did I let everyone down? Or, and even people know that it's a
Mhm.
team effort, you feel like as a leader that you did do something wrong. If you couldn't do anything different, right? Or it
Right.
just, this would have made everything easier. And so I think it's really important, yeah, just to realize that it is lonely and that there's not necessarily anything that can be done to fix it, but let's look at where we go next.
Yeah. Just move forward.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Oh, Maria, I could talk to you all day. Thank you. I think this was just really good. And I think it's also really important to know that, like, someone, like who has won so many accolades and awards and who, has just done so much, to know that you have those moments.
Yeah.
And to know, because I think a lot of times when we see people who are successful and, we see them on stages, we're like, wow, like, that must be so amazing to have that life. And it's like, no, you know what? The no's still hit and we still have to get through them.
I have a picture that I always show for things when I give presentations, right? And it's a white piece of paper. And then I have another one where it's like a piece of paper with stick figures and things. And then, I go to, this is how we make a game. And I think that is really important because I heard once somebody say, we compare our first drafts to other people's finished products, right? And we don't
Oh,
see
yeah.
all the things that go in behind the scenes, that all the things that go into it, all of the no's and the practice and the various different things. And I think that's really, really important that we do that. And someone's saying, my sister was actually saying that, people call an overnight success something that happens when you haven't been paying attention. That does not mean that the person achieves success overnight. And
No,
I
it's
think
like 7 years.
exactly, exactly. And even with startups, you'll hear like this company can actually, if you look at it, sometimes you look back, they've been working on this idea for, 5 years, but they incorporated a year ago, or this idea was a spin-off of something they
Right.
did at another company they'd been working on for 8 years. And so sometimes when you dig below the surface of things, you find that actually it is not as
Yeah, spontaneous as, yeah.
exactly. And it's probably because people like feel good stories, not like, well, things were really bad for a while, and then
Yeah.
they got better,
This
and
guy
then we thought
sold
we were
his car for this business.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important, is just to, like, I really focus on, the stories that you hear are not always the full story.
Yes.
And yeah, there's a lot of no's, no matter who you are, that go on behind the scenes, I'm sure.
100%. Thank you for sharing that with us, Maria, and we hope to have you here again
So
soon. Thank you. And, for those of you who want to meet Maria Burns Ortiz more, follow her on LinkedIn, go check out Seven Generations Games, and, keep listening to her episodes here on Corporate Cafecito. Thank you.
thanks.